This is the Cruciform Conversations Podcast, where we explore the healing and transforming love of God and seek to be peacemakers and reconcilers in a fractured world. I'm your host, Greg Arthur. To find out more and engage in the conversation, make sure you subscribe to the Cruciform Reflections Substack at drgregarthur.substack.com. Well, thanks for joining us on the Cruciform Conversations Podcast. My name is Greg Arthur. I'm your host for this conversation. Today, I'm joined by my friend, Dr. Ray Kim, to talk about religious extremism, peacemaking, dialogue, and the big question I think a lot of leaders are asking, which is, where do we go from here? Hey, Ray, thanks for joining me and for, giving us some time to give your thoughts today.
Happy to be on with you, Greg.
If you haven't encountered Ray's work before, Ray is the Director of U.S. Programs and Partnerships at the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, ICRD. I always have to think about what that acronym stands for. And Ray leads efforts to counteract toxic polarization and to help rebuild social cohesion, working with faith leaders and communities across the U.S. He brings a lot of experience in conflict transformation and mediation and depolarization, designing and facilitating workshops, dialogue, and trying to help communities think about really fighting against violent extremism. So he earned his PhD in theology and religious studies from Georgetown, where he also does some adjunct teaching. And he's got all sorts of specialties, but we're going to tap into Ray's deep brain of insights to get some answers today, because we have some burning questions. But before we dig into the big cultural questions and fix the world, we got to start somewhat lighter. What are you watching these days? Any shows you're following? Any movies? I mean, I know baseball playoffs are just kicking off, so that's forefront of your thought. But anything else you've been getting into?
I mean, yeah, definitely watching all the Dodger games for as long as they are in the playoffs, right? So I'm wishing for a very long.
You're hopeful for weeks of content.
Yeah, exactly.
Weeks and weeks of content.
Weeks and weeks. But I think right now, I mean, I just finished a Netflix K-drama called The Tyrant's Chef or something.
Oh, interesting.
I enjoyed it. Me and my wife watched it together. It's like a mix on like time travel, culinary stuff, a little bit of romance and things like that. So it's really light watching. Something I want to watch that I haven't watched yet is a new horror movie called Weapons. And I do want to watch. Yeah, so that's one thing I want to watch that I haven't watched yet because I love horror movies.
There you go. My son has really gotten into cinema in the last couple of years, and he's just found horror as like a genre he's interested in. So I will dive into it sometimes with him when he's around, not when he's at college. Don't get to it now, but trying to like doing some of the crossover into what's interesting there and thinking about it. So you'll have to let me know if that one's worth seeing after you find time for it. So one of the things I wanted to talk with, invite Ray in to chat about, he's one of my favorite conversation partners. I find everything Ray has to share makes me think differently and deeply about things. And what really struck me in the last couple of weeks is we were sitting in this particular moment as a country and as the church that as I talk to leaders, people just seem shocked and a little uncertain of what comes next. I mean, just in the past few weeks, we have seen the continued escalation of ICE activity, renewed commitments to deploy U.S. troops to major U.S. cities. We've seen the murder of Charlie Kirk and all the subsequent controversy, the debate that followed that, news feed that seemingly filled continuously with gun violence, multiple school shootings, the horrific terror attack on the Mormon church in Michigan. I mean, I could go on. I don't want to go on. I think we all know what's living within that. And I'm just curious, as somebody who's spent a lot of time studying and working to counteract toxic polarization and religious extremism, how are you making sense of what we're seeing in our country right now?
I mean, it's hard to say I am making sense of all of that, trying, and our team is trying, and I'm sure everybody who's listening is trying their best. It's going to be no small feat. I feel like every day that the chasm is kind of widening, right? I think all those things you just said, right? Whether it's increased ICE activity, whether or not Charlie Kirk was a martyr for his faith or not, et cetera, et cetera. It's like those who will see it one way will deem those who see it the other way as somehow inherently evil, right? Like, let's say, if you don't think that increased ICE activity in this country is good, then you clearly don't care about like average everyday American citizens, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very moralized, and vice versa. If you can't see that increased ICE activity in this country is terrible and a road towards like despotic authoritarianism, then it's because you're clearly a fascist. And these camps are getting larger and larger, more consolidated, and our ability to kind of talk through these very contentious topics is getting harder and harder. And I think that feeds into what more and more, I think I hear people saying like, it feels like we're living in two different worlds. Like I see the world that I live in and, this is the way I see it. And then, but this person who disagrees with me, like we don't even agree on some of the facts and let alone like what is good and what is bad, it seems like. And that's a very scary place to end up, I think. And I hope that we don't stay in this space for too long.
Yeah, the absence of starting point, I think, is one of the things that I'm not quite sure what to do with, in that we've lost some of the foundations and the structure of truth, or how we would approach the finding of truth. And that is a distinctive shift that has taken place. Some philosophers call it, we're living in a post-truth reality, right? Where it's not we're creating our own truth we distrust inherently top-down structures or institutions, and there's lots of elements of that. But I find that for people who see things differently than me, that when I try to even engage with and start a conversation, there is a tremendous amount of groundwork to do to even figure out where to start the conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, when you say that it seems like we're constructing our own truths, there's a part of me that might argue that that's always been the case. I think, though, at the same time, what you mentioned, this kind of postmodern turn where we become very skeptical of grand narratives and things like that, and we've kind of and institutions and frameworks and universal frameworks. And we kind of threw all that out and we became deeply skeptical about things that try to or purport to be like these grand stories that will explain everything.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've replaced that with this kind of certitude in facts and information, perhaps. But in so doing, we've also made a false equivalency as if more facts will lead to greater truth. I don't think those are always the case. And I'm referencing here a German Korean philosopher named Byung-Chul Han. I think his most famous book, I believe, is called The Anxious Generation or Burnout Generation or Burnout Society. I forget. But Byung-Chul Han, he's written on a lot of different topics, but this distinction between truth and information is one that features prominently in some of his work. And he likens it to kind of like, he would say information is like snowdrift. We can keep piling on more and more information, and like snowdrift, it will build and build and build, and eventually we'll have this mound of snow, right? Or this mound of information. But he distinguishes this mound of information from truth, and he says truth is actually more like this glade or this little peaceful area in the forest that you're just walking through this forest and you just happen upon it. And then you're like, aha, like this is truth that you've kind of stumbled upon or come across. It can't be built up like a snowbank. And in this day and age where we have like AI facilitated tools that give instant information right at your fingertip, right? On our phones, on our computers, in this digital age where access to information is so egalitarian and so equitable. That's great. That's an awesome thing. But philosophically, we as human beings may have made a false equivalency as if I know more facts, then I'm going to get closer to the truth. And hence this kind of there was a kind of overemphasis or obsession with fact checking. And then we learned the hard way, we're not going to convince anyone with more fact checking. And so I think we're learning the hard way that more facts actually doesn't get us closer to the truth. But I think because you pointed out like that, we craft our truth. Byung-Chul Han would say truth is always tied up in narratives. It's always a story. We're taking evidence from our lives and our experiences and other people's lives and experiences, and we're trying to connect the dots as best as possible and saying, like, how do I make sense of this? Like, why did this happen? And I think the better we can get at hearing each other's stories and being able to sit with multiple stories, sometimes competing stories together, the better off we'll be and the better and closer we will be to whatever truth exists.
Yeah. And so I'm wondering if, and I don't want to go into oversimplifying this, but if what we're seeing take place culturally, if there are different movements or pockets of people for whom the pursuit of truth looks entirely different. And that's part of what's shaping the world. So if you have those who are more inclined towards trusting academic research, scientific studies, and that their pursuit of truth is, what do experts say? What is provable? And it is an accumulation of knowledge over time, where for others, if there is a distrust to that or a sense that the world that has been built by that isn't true, or it's telling me things that I know aren't true, or I cannot align with my understanding and experience of the world, then I'm going to go through a different process. And it's going to be appealing to find something that undercuts that. And so the more populist movements that we're seeing have often been a rejection of that and a looking for a different epistemology, right? A different means of truth. And for some, like, you can point to the way in which President Trump functions as sort of an epistemology for some, right? Whatever he says is true, even if it's not true. That's not the point. The point isn't sometimes even that the truth is real, but this becomes the truth that explains the narrative of what's happening. Like, is that correlating with what you're sort of naming, or how you see things, this pursuit of truth taking place?
Yeah, and there are, I think you're right to point out kind of now the emergence of like competing epistemological sources or foundations. And we are almost at times like weaponizing our own epistemological sources against another's.
Yeah, absolutely.
Casting suspicion upon someone else's sources, right, that they're using as best as they can. And I think, however, if we're going to try as a human species to, I don't know, like decrease or narrow that gap or prevent this divergence from getting wider and wider, we need to try different strategies and tactics and communication styles rather than like trying to evaluate whose is more right and whose is more wrong. Like, it's not going to move the needle, unfortunately. And that is because, as with any great story, there is something underlying it. There's an emotional, affective element to it as well, right? I think if we think about all the great stories that we've read, that we've seen on movies or watched, like, there's a compelling emotional kind of hook, right? A post-plot pressure, by some people who study narratives would say. And it will either drive the person towards action or do something about it, right? And I think it can be towards constructive ends or even destructive ends, right? And so that's why I've been trying to focus most of our like kind of our work now on like, yeah, like how do we, one, tell better stories? Because I think people usually take when they're confronted with somebody who disagrees with them, like, let me tell you my facts, as if like the facts speak for themselves. The authenticity of these facts speak for themselves.
It's self-evident. We believe these truths to be self-evident, right? That this is a posture.
But that's not a great story. And I'm wondering if we can help, even, you know, like in our attempts to state our position, we are telling a story about like, hey, this is how I've come to hold these sets of epistemological resources as valid over and against others. These are some of my personal experience that led me to this point where I hold these positions. Does any of that speak to you? And I would guarantee you'd probably get a different response from that person than like if you were to take the, well, let me give you like the 5 best facts I got. Like, and I'm gonna blow your socks with these. I bet you didn't know.
Right. No, and I think especially in this particular cultural moment, we are seeing the war between different stories of America.
Yeah.
What is the American story? And there is this fight to the point of literally what's being taught in schools and museums, like this fight for the narrative of America, which we're not going to fix on that grand scale. But if we're actually looking to engage with our neighbor and get to know someone, giving our American story and being able to share it with somebody and being able to hold these different stories to be true at the same time, I think really is like what you're naming. It's a powerful tool for taking that battle and grounding it in something far different.
Yeah. Because I think if you leave it at that like grand cosmological battle, like kind of frame, it leads people to do some very terrible things, because it's like ultimate existential framing that is also very disembodied. And the casualties of that conflict or those battles are like not real, like, because they're like, these are concepts, these are abstracted entities, even though the lived reality is there are people who are going to bear the consequences of some of these stories taking hold and driving policy decisions and you know, divestments in social infrastructure, et cetera, right? Like, so our stories do have material consequences, and I hope that our, you know, listeners aren't kind of walking away with this as like, oh, we're just telling stories. Like, no, like our stories have dire material consequences, and that's why we need to take them seriously.
So unpack that, what you mean by that. So, because I think that's the crucial point we've gotten to in thinking about making sense of this, or just trying to make sense of this on a local level with people near us, of sharing our stories, holding someone else's stories. But what are the consequences? What are the dire material consequences of our stories, and why we need to understand them and be able to share them and listen to one another?
I mean, I think it's helpful to maybe take a lesson from our recent history, right? One that is maybe not as fraught as some of the ongoing conflicts right now. But
Yeah.
like let's take the global war on terror,
Hmm.
for example. That devastated countries, like actual countries that are still recovering or have recently fallen back into disarray. And that was because we as a nation told a story that was on the one hand trying to do good, where trying to give Americans hope and courage at a time when they were experiencing mass trauma, right? An attack on American soil that was unprecedented, basically,
Yeah.
right? And so I understand like the need for a story to kind of bring us together. But in our, I think, well-intentioned attempts at creating a story like that, we ended up creating an enemy that needed to be vanquished. And unfortunately, we didn't tell our story well enough that that enemy just suddenly became Muslim people.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And even in our own country, that narrative then created systems of racial profiling and police surveillance in Muslim communities, and tactics deployed under the guise of counterterrorism, where communities were essentially divided, where we said there are good Muslims and bad Muslims among us. And the good Muslims need to do their due diligence as patriots and citizens of this country to prove just how good they are against those bad Muslims among us, right? And so there you had like narking on, like Muslim communities who couldn't trust one another, and not to mention the erosion of trust between Muslim communities and law enforcement, but then also Muslim communities with the broader American public, right? And now we're still rebuilding that trust. And
Right.
so that's just one example in recent history of how a narrative that, yeah, like was intended for good and was needed perhaps in that context, wasn't told in a way that was careful enough or paid attention to some of the real dire consequences that such a narrative could have down the road.
Yeah, and also the telling of the stories of, right, I have a number of friends who served in the military in a post 9/11 world, and for various time frames and did various roles, some of them for decades. And their stories are of the deep, lingering cost endured by those who went to fight a war on terrorism, right? And the cost to them and their health, the moral injury, whatever, right? Like it's part of the story that has to be told to how we think about this, right? So yeah, anyway, so just another example of where, here's the story, but what's the actual story that we can hold for people and for one another?
Yes.
So as you're thinking about that, when I hear you applying is thinking, okay, like where do these narratives happen? Where is extremism happening? How do we begin to place it, connect our stories to it, maybe subvert it a bit? ICRD does a lot of work outside the U.S. I mean, you're the U.S. programming part, but the rest of the staff does stuff not U.S., right?
Right.
Especially within that. Do you have any parallels or examples from outside the U.S. that we can learn from, that maybe we're just unaware of, about how this has been at work in other places, or work you've done or programming that would just give us some glimpses of hope or making sense of sort of what's happening compared to some other locations?
Yeah, this is a context that we haven't worked in directly, but we have a lot of friends in the community of practice that have worked in this space and who partner with us, and many times, helping us lead workshops and facilitations. But these are our friends from Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And a haunting lesson that we can learn, and a reminder that they constantly give us is, Ray, like, we don't remember when the violence all decided to start. And these are people who lived through the Troubles.
Yeah.
They would tell us, there wasn't this one day that we can mark on the calendar where neighbors were planting pipe bombs in each other's houses. It just happened. And it's so subtle and it's so sinister how it just kind of creeps in. Because arguably before violent outbreak happened, like, I'm sure people living in Northern Ireland were like, that's preposterous. We would never do something like that, until it started to happen. Right. Then it just became the norm. And their kind of caution to us is, we're seeing all the same red flags here in the US. And right now, many of you still think like you guys are like somehow exceptionally like immune
Right.
to maybe human nature or like violence or something, but we also thought that too. And then it wasn't until we were knee deep in it that we're like, wow, how did we get here? And by then, the work is so much harder. And so, I mean, that is a that's one kind of lesson we've learned from our international friends and doing work in the international context. Some other things that I can draw on are like, for sure, like I think doing a lot of preventing violent extremism in like Middle East, North Africa, and that region. One of the recurring kind of things is people who are vulnerable to recruitment and radicalization into the violent extremist organizations. Not everybody's joining it because of the ideological stuff. And I think that's an important thing to remind ourselves as well. Like even in the US, probably there are a lot of people who are joining, whether it's the Proud Boys or the various other domestic violent extremist groups that are currently active, whether neo-Nazi groups, white nationalist groups, etc. It's so many of them may not join initially because of the ideology, but spending enough time in that social network, and if that is the only social network that you have, you're probably going to eventually kind of take in some of the ideological stuff. But understanding that people's motivations for joining these organizations is multifaceted, and some of the biggest push factors are lack of social connectivity, and two, some of the very practical material concerns of like material needs. The reason why there is a disproportionately high number of former military, former law enforcement being recruited into a lot of these spaces is because not only do they have a certain set of skill sets that's really attractive to some of these groups, but especially, going back to your story about, your friends who served, many of our veterans are left kind of hanging out to dry on their own. And these organizations are really good at finding weak, vulnerable people who are kind of down on their luck and saying like, hey, brother, not only will we be able to provide you a sense of, not only will we be able to provide you like with material support, right, a job, some social networks, friends, like, do you need clothes? Do you need food? Do you need a place to stay? But they'll also be like, we'll also provide you a sense of belonging and purpose that you clearly have lost. And that's a powerful, powerful thing. And that like will hook into somebody, right? Because beyond the material needs, that sense of belonging and purpose, that's what keeps people alive. And we found that in our international context, but also increasingly the studies show here as well. People who are working in the domestic space, like a lot of the same kind of human dynamics and the human needs are present here. It's just manifesting slightly different forms, right? And different needs perhaps, but it's there.
Well, and to put it in theological terms, right? What you're describing is this incarnational reality, right? Of embodying good news for a group. It's just an anti-gospel example. Right? We're embodying good news and belonging and showing up, and we're demonstrating our belief in you and your belonging. It's just for the radicalization towards violence or separation. But this is, and counteracting that, I would hope our imagination as a church would immediately be this, well, we're good at that, or we're supposed to do that. Yeah. We're supposed to be great at the incarnational part where we are embodying the active needs, the connection, the community, the literal physical needs of people who are vulnerable and exploited or alone, isolated, and therefore giving them belonging and leading them through transformation and healing. So, there's sort of a gospel, anti-gospel comparison there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that is why we as an organization believe that faith communities they should have a leg up on this. Like, this is their purview.
Right.
Messaging around belonging and meaning and purpose, but also not just cheap talk, but like actually living that out in a communal form. Like, if that is not what a faith community is, then like, I don't know what is, right? And so it does also beg the question, why are so many people in our country suffering from social disconnectivity, lack of meaning, lack of belonging, lack of purpose? Yeah. Especially young people.
Especially young people, and especially what we're seeing right now with a lot of this radicalization is young men. I think one of the not often enough talked about forces at work in a lot of this violence is both sides of our particular ideological persuasion in our U.S. want to just point to the other every time something happens as, see, it was that ideology or that ideology, without addressing what's working across the spectrum for young men and how they're being shaped through a virtual world is is aligning with drawing them into more violence, more social disconnection, and a lot of these things that it almost doesn't matter, right? This is the confusion oftentimes in some of these violent eruptions where we're trying to explain it based on, well, they believe this, well, they believe that. And quite often into these investigations, we discover they actually don't fit the profile that would have made sense to us as to the type of person enacting this violence. But it's because we're sort of almost not getting to the thing that causes the radicalization towards violence or that movement to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and a lot of counterterrorism studies now will say like very, 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 very few people are actually committing acts based on like alignment with some kind of ideology alone. Like that is not the primary driver. It'd be really bad strategy to try to prevent violent extremism just based off that. And so it's a lot of other social factors as well that goes into this, personal factors as well. Sometimes it is like literally mental health stuff. Like somebody is struggling with that. And that is, but then the personal kind of struggles can be exacerbated by a lack of social infrastructure for somebody to access mental health resources and things like that, right? So there's no one track towards somebody leading to committing acts of such, tragedy and violence and destruction. And I do think that because in the US at least, and also Europe, violence prevention in all its forms has fortunately taken on a good kind of, we turned a new leaf, I guess, to say, for lack of a better way to put it, but we've adopted like a public health approach and model to violence prevention where we're understanding that violence is very much like we can treat it as like a viral outbreak or a social epidemic. And it takes all of society to kind of help address that, right? Like doctors are not the only ones combating a viral outbreak. It requires all of us to clean up, wash our hands diligently, put our masks on, etc. It's a whole of society approach to address that issue. Same with violence prevention. It requires a whole of society kind of effort to not profile and like surveil and police certain individuals more, but more like how do we create a thriving, flourishing human environment where people who may be struggling with mental health don't end up in a place where like they don't have resources, they have no one to talk to, and then they're on the dark web trying to find help. Right? Like how do we create environments where people who maybe have certain vulnerabilities and risks are not exploited?
So can you give us some, I mean, this peacemaking work you're naming here, right, of healing and sort of upstream and societal wide, I know this is some of the work that you've done in your programming of working with local communities, faith leaders, to try to actively engage in this. Could you give us some examples to hang our hats on, to inspire us, to get our minds thinking, maybe expand our imagination for what this looks like on the ground and how we might consider these sorts of interventions and works in our own communities?
Yeah. For the last 2.5 years, we've been working very closely with a network of churches in the Pacific Northwest and in Portland, Oregon specifically. What started off as like a very basic, like perhaps like a program on depolarization, right? Like we're like, okay, these are churches who said that they worry about polarization both within their communities, but also around them. And that they want to somehow become more resilient to this polarization or learn how to navigate polarization in a healthier way. And also perhaps if they're a community struggling with polarization, how do we depolarize, right? So it started off very kind of straightforward like that. But I think throughout the years and as the kind of our work progressed, we realized so much of the work we were doing was also predicated on communal healing. These are communities who experienced deep relational ruptures, and there are wounds that are left from deep relational ruptures. Imagine a family that you worshiped with and served with for 10 plus years suddenly up and leave over something that you said or something that you preached or like, whoa, I didn't know our church believed in that, and then suddenly they're like, well, I'm going to go find and so there's a deep sense of betrayal as well that probably a lot of the community members are feeling. And so on the one hand, at a more like human fundamental level, we realize, oh wow, like our work involves a lot of healing, communal healing, not just individual healing, but healing as a community. And then from there, envisioning like, well, how do we, the term that they landed on was, how do we really manifest the beloved community? Because they were like, we weren't that. If we were that, we may not have experienced what we had to unfortunately experience in the years past. But moving forward, how do we manifest this beloved community? And then that's a community that isn't simply homogenous, that isn't trying to say like, oh, you're in, you're out based on these 10 commandments or, these like doctrinal statements, like who isn't putting people through a purity test, essentially, but also creating an environment that models healthier human relationships, models healthier ways of communicating with one another, and modeling what it actually takes to foster really loving relationships that are deep, thick, and strong enough to withstand whatever culture war, tremors, or turmoil comes their way. Because they realized and they learned the hard way that so many of the relationships that they were fostering and that they thought were discipling into their followers was so fragile. And that was a hard lesson. But they're like, okay, then what do we need to do differently in our discipleship, in our spiritual formation to lead to thicker, deeper, more durable relationships that aren't so fragile, that can stretch and bend, but absorb those tremors. And we took this approach because we're like, look, it'd be unsustainable to just kind of, I don't know, like look for the people who are in your communities who are like vulnerable and at risk. Like that creates this kind of pathology that would be really unhealthy. But taking the approach of like, look, you guys are a church who claims to be welcoming, who wants to say we're always inviting new people into our community and trying to put our best foot forward. Well, okay, great. Then you don't know who's walking through your church doors on a given Sunday. And that person may be one of those people who are like, I don't have a place to go. And they just so happen, the Spirit led them to just walk through your doors that one day. Are they going to be leaving kind of transformed and impacted? Are they going to be walking away from that Sunday service being like, wow, like this is a really loving community. This isn't a community that is driven by hate, that isn't driven by fear. I think fear is probably the biggest thing where we end up doing a lot of things that we regret because we let fear take over. And I think communities are really fragile when they're fearful. And something that we've always talked about in that church context was like, we believe, like we claim to believe in a gospel that is so radical and so powerful that it overcame death itself. And yet when we live it out and we look around our communities and our churches, like why does it feel like the gospel message that we're preaching seems so impoverished that it can't withstand a little disagreement or a little debate? Why are we so afraid of hashing out difficult conversations or uncomfortable conversations? Like where is the lack of faith coming from?
Right. And why is our discipleship and spiritual formation, why has it neglected to prepare us for the crucial work of having this dialogue for the point of reconciliation and healing? Like we have not built those muscles. We haven't built those practices. We have no experience of it. So when something large comes up, we are completely ill prepared for it and seemingly shocked that our faith would require us to walk into it.
Well, yeah, absolutely. 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 And, I mean, that reconciliation part is really important because I forget where I heard this and I want to give credit to that person, but I can't recall the name, but essentially what they said was, Christ's salvific work on the cross is the most radical form of reconciliation ever. That the divide between life and death itself was closed. And she was like, if we are an Easter people and we truly believe in that we have a moral responsibility to look at the divisions that we allow to exist in our lives, the relationships that we allowed to remain strained. And I felt so convicted. Like I was like, like when I heard that, because she was like, like we all have family members or friends or somebody whose relationships have become strained over these past few years. And she's like, as Christians, she wants us to take a really hard look at like, why are we allowing that to remain that way? Are we working to foster that reconciliation and that heal that rupture? Or are we somehow falling back on this very like, and it's like a platitude or like a blasé statement to say like divisions or, differences are a part of life or disagreements are just going to happen, right? Conflict is a part of life. But I think her warning is, I think, appropriate because I think sometimes we can use that as a crutch, as if it's just going to happen, then there's nothing really I can do about it. But I think as Christians, she's challenging us like, no, there is something you can do about it. Because Christ didn't just sit back and say, sin just happens.
Right, right. No, this is great. And to sort of like pull us back in from where we started, right? So if in this moment of deep lament and sadness about what we are seeing, the violence we're seeing erupting, um, the toxic polarization, some of the rise of extremism, with all of these forces we seem incapable of doing anything about, right? Like we're not going to go fix this. What we can do on a very real level in our communities is create the sort of culture in the space where we do navigate conflict well. We're always looking to heal the ruptures between us. And we're trying to create an environment where whoever walks into our life, whoever we encounter out the world, we can and will be these ambassadors of reconciliation. We will be a cruciform people. We will go out and live this in such a way that maybe what we're doing is actually preventing and changing some of the downstream issues, right? Yeah. That we are interrupting some of this cycle of violence or despair or isolation that ferments and fosters, some of this other stuff.
Yeah, and I think the data from our Portland work actually helped kind of for us see a potentially like emerging hypothesis. And it's a hypothesis for now because we've got to continue testing it. We got to work with various other communities to see if it still holds. But one of the emergent hypotheses was that when participants were able, or when church members were able to find a very personal relational reason for adopting whether dialogical skills or compassionate listening or whatever, when they were able to find that deep relational personal reason, those immediately translated into sustainable practices. So it didn't just remain in this like kind of conceptual mind frame of like, I want to talk to people who disagree with me. I want to have that conversation with people who are of a different political affiliation. Like, it was no longer simply an attitudinal change, but it immediately manifested in behavioral changes. And we think that is the most sustainable route, because I think a lot of dialogue-based work is great. I'm not gonna like poo-poo, my friends who are in this field. Absolutely not. But a lot of it still is primarily like kind of rooted in like, we need to be more civil. And I think civil discourse is a great motivating factor, right? The fact that we've lost civility perhaps in our political leaders and things like that.
Better than uncivil discourse.
Exactly.
Let's be clear.
Better than uncivil discourse.
Better than, but not necessarily the goal or what's going to actually bring about change.
Yes. And so I question whether or not civility is the end goal, right, in and of itself. But I think civility simply is the means. I think the end goal has to be reconciliation.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the healing of these ruptures, right? And so we can take a lot of different routes to get there, but I do believe that the church has a very unique and special role to play in that.
Yeah, agreed. Beautiful. Well, Ray, thanks for your time and for your thoughts. You help us to think deeply and better about some of this. I appreciate your input and your ideas, and maybe we'll get a chance to test out some of this hypothesis and see that it actually works. So
yes. So for all those who are listening in, if you are leading or part of a faith community like who would love to partner in this work, please reach out. Please reach out to us.
Where do people find you, Ray, if they want to partner or find out more?
You can email me directly at ray@icrd.org.
Great. I'll throw that in there for the notes for people. So all right, Ray, thanks, and good luck. May it be weeks of baseball joy for you. May you truly, hopefully by the time this episode comes out, it won't all have crashed and burned for you as a Dodgers fan.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate you.
Thanks for listening to Cruciform Conversations. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube, and to visit the Cruciform Reflection Substack at drgregarthur.substack.com.